right, a very warm welcome to everybody here at the Austrian Institute for International Affairs, the AIIB. The series of events we are doing now all in person again after we had switched to online and hybrid during the Corona times is starting again after the summer. We're looking forward to many events this fall and winter. We hope to see you at many of those. We have today's event in cooperation with, as part of our cooperation with the Ministry of Defense. We have a lot of these events on major power relations and geopolitical issues. And since a couple of years ago, we have also started to focus more on China with these events. And we want to now broaden this even more to have more of a look at emerging powers in what is shaping up to be a multipolar order. Welcome, everybody. So what we've planned for today is to talk about the relationship between Asia's two giants, China and India. We are framing it as this question of overlapping or conflicting interests. Are the two of them partners in the global south, or are they rivals in the Himalayas? And to do this, we have two great scholars with us today. We have Dr. Jagannath Panda, the head of the Stockholm Center for South Asian and Indo-Pacific Affairs at the Institute for Security and Development Policy in Stockholm. And we have Dr. Justyna Szczudlik, Deputy Head of Research and Coordinator of the Asia-Pacific Program at the Polish Institute of International Affairs. Dr. Panda is also a professor at the Department of Regional and Global Studies at the University of Warsaw and a senior fellow at the Hague Center for Strategic Studies in the Netherlands. Next to that, he has several high-profile affiliations in Asia. And before coming to Europe, he was a very prominent think tanker in New Delhi. For more than 15 years. He's the series editor for the Routledge book series Think Asia and published his book India-China Relations with Routledge. One of many books, I may say, and next to many articles in prestigious journals and a very prolific media presence. His current research focus includes India's relations with China, the European Union and NATO, as well as the EU's role in the Indo-Pacific. Dr. Szczudlik is among a very small group of the best and most influential China analysts in Poland and has been with the Polish Institute of International Affairs for more than 15 years. Through the European China Think Tank Network and many other channels, she's a very prominent fixture of China research in Europe. Her research focuses on China's foreign policy more broadly in its strategy and particularly also China's neighborhood policy and its relations with the EU and NATO. It is an absolute treat to have both of you here tonight and I thank you very much for coming to Vienna. I am Thomas Eder and I cover China's foreign and security policy for the Austrian Institute for International Affairs. Now, for the topic today, what I already hinted at in the beginning, China and India still portray themselves as developing states, even if they are global top 5 economies and have taken the lead on several technologies. And of course, it's mainly China that has also moved up drastically in GDP per capita lists. and has certainly sent tremors through European industries as it challenges the leading positions now also in the automobile sector. Both countries would like to further certain interests but also lead what is now often called the Global South. Now that might indicate cooperation, but it could also indicate friction. The term Global South basically describes developing and emerging economies, though interestingly they must be outside of Europe and are then included, even though some of them have considerably higher GDP per capita than some emerging economies in Europe. China and India have indeed been pulled together in the past, for example, by overlapping trade interests and economic interests more broadly. Now this also goes as to the reform negotiations that still happened in the early 2000s on the World Trade Organizations, the Doha Round. They found themselves on the same side of certain issues there. Then, of course, in the G20, they are part of a group of developing and emerging economies included there. And they have been first grouped together by economists in the so-called BRICS group, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, large emerging economies. But then also develop this economic framing into a mini or multilateral grouping that has, to a degree, been institutionalized and has geopolitical implications as well. Now, we will get more into the recent interactions in the multilateral realm and if and where interests really still overlap. Also in the bilateral relationship, there used to be a positive trend only 6 or so years ago, but things have certainly become more difficult afterwards, and we're going to talk about why. Some of the reasons certainly are that the two disagree on a number of reforms of the global order. And as you may know, as we speak, the United Nations Summit of the Future is going on, and certainly there's a lot of discussions about the future of the global order at the moment. Now, next to these issues, there have been tense border disputes between the two countries, and we're going to get into that. It certainly should be on our agenda in Europe as well, when the soldiers of two nuclear powers have engaged in deadly clashes on the border. Such developments lead to questions about China's and India's foreign security policy strategy more broadly. How important are they to each other, this bilateral relationship, and the cooperation in the multilateral realm? How risk tolerant are they in this relationship and where they meet each other? How risk tolerant are they in their neighborhood more broadly and in their foreign policy? In other words, we should deal in the end also with the question of how far would they go if the relationship deteriorates, and how likely is escalation, and what would that look like? Now, with all of this in mind, I would now like to invite both speakers to provide us with their kickoff statements for this discussion. We have agreed on short kickoff statements of 5 to 7 minutes. And afterwards, I will ask them a few questions each to get us going on this discussion, and we'll then open up the floor for questions from all of you. Now, if you would like to begin, Dr. Studlik, what I would be interested in is now Beijing's perspective, its logic for its foreign and security policy strategy more broadly, and sort of how India fits in what China wants to do and what does it want to do, and how the multilateral institutions that they are both part of figure in this strategy. So perhaps you could give us a first indication of what China wants to achieve in this context, and perhaps specifically with its neighborhood.
Okay, so thanks, Thomas. Good afternoon. It's my great pleasure to be here in Vienna together with Jagannath. To be honest, everybody knows Jagannath, but it's the first time I met Jagannath in person, so I'm so happy. And I would like to be. Try to be very, very brief. But before I start, let me answer the question from our title, because the question is if China and India are partners in the global south or rivals. And for me, it is very easy answer that China and India are rivals, not partners. And I would like to tell you why I think that those two countries are rivals. So let me say a few words about China's foreign and security policy logic and China's goal. So first of all, let me say what's China's security policy goal. And I would like to quote Article 1 from the National Security Law that was adopted in 2015. And it is very interesting two elements of this Article 5. The first, what is national security? What's the definition of China's national security? The first point is to maintain the political regime, which is people's democratic dictatorship and socialist system with Chinese characteristics. So let's rephrase, it's to keep the CCP regime in power. So the first part. And the second one is very important, and this has a connection with India on this Himalaya region. It's the implementation of the Great Rejuvenation of Chinese nation. Great Rejuvenation of Chinese nation is something that Xi Jinping said in 2012 as a Chinese dream, which means to reunify all these Chinese or used to be Chinese territories. And this refers to something that China calls core interests. Core interest is something absolutely crucial for China, something that is not negotiable. That China will not like to negotiate. And of course, we do not have the catalog of core interests. For years, it was mostly Taiwan, Tibet, Hong Kong. And I tried to find if, let's say, Himalaya region is core interest, so not yet. But I could assume that China in few years could call some kind of this region as a core interest. I don't know. Tibet for sure is core interest. So this is something that we should bear in mind, that this region is very important for China because could be partly is China's core interest because it's Tibet, but also if we know that there are some border disputes with India, so for sure this part of from Chinese perspective is core interest. And what is also interesting when it comes to the security policy, but also China's perception of the global order, is what Xi Jinping is using very often, the slogan of a community of shared destiny of mankind. I could not explain exactly what it means, but generally speaking, it is a global order when China is in the center, and it's a Sinocentric global order. And frankly speaking, I tried to find if Xi Jinping said something about a community of shared destiny together with Himalaya region, and he said, in 2021, he said that Himalaya region should be part of this community of shared destiny of mankind, which means it should be under the Chinese umbrella, under Chinese influence. And then a few words about foreign policy goals in Asia Pacific, because I think that we could analyze the China's foreign policy through the three circles framework. Like the first circle, and the concept assumes that the foreign policies focus on 3 areas, which might be depicted as 3 concentric rings, and China is in the center. So the first circle embraces the neighborhood, the second Asia-Pacific, and the third the Cold War. So now we are talking mostly about the first and the second circle. So when it comes to China's foreign policy in Asia, so in a neighborhood in Asia-Pacific, China has 2 goals. The first one is to pull out the US from the region and to govern the region by the Asian people, but to be honest, from Chinese perspective, by China. And why by Asian people? Because it is very interesting speech given by Xi Jinping in 2014. It was the so-called key conference in Shanghai, and Putin took part in this conference. And he gave a speech that could be summarized in Asia for Asians. So pull out the United States from the region, destroy or undermine the alliances that United States has with the countries in this region. So this is the first goal. And the second one, to make the countries in the region dependent on China. And when you look what China is doing in its neighborhood with India in the Himalayan region, is China is doing exactly this. It's trying to depend those countries on China. So this is why I think that from Chinese perspective, India is a rival, not a partner. And going to this, what Thomas said about this multilateral organizations like BRICS and Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Well, my understanding is that it's not that those 2 organizations that have been mentioned are not multilateral organizations from Chinese perspective. I will call it that is a kind of an implementation of China's multilateral bilateralism. And this kind of multilateral bilateralism, this notion, I was told by someone in Shanghai a few years ago when we were talking about 16+1 formula. 16+1 formula is something that China developed in 2012. It was China plus 16 countries from Central Europe. And it is not an international organization, like we have different kind of interactions between different countries that are under this framework. It is mostly China-led institutions, and it is very difficult to find some cohesive interests. So I would say that there is no potential within this Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but also BRICS Plus. There is a symmetry between economies, and China is the biggest economy. So there is no cooperation between different countries, but cooperation between individual countries and China. So I do not call it multilateral organizations, like a China-led organization, multilateral bilateralism in practice when it comes to China. And the last three points, because I tried thinking about this BRICS and Shanghai Cooperation Organizations. What was the glue that sticks those countries together, that we have this kind of a platform? Shanghai Cooperation Organization is organization, but BRICS is not. It's like a platform. There are 3 elements that stick them together. The first one is to some extent anti-Western sentiment, including India, because India is perceived as a swing state. Okay, pretty good relations with the United States, with Europe, but still India doesn't want to take sides. So it's a, let's say, anti-Western sentiment to some extent. Those countries, except China, are not, let's say, superpowers. So the power projection is pretty limited, I would say. And the third, pretty controversial, sorry for that, but those countries are not fully fledged democracies. So I will stop here, and then later on I will talk more about this kind of China-India cooperation that is not cooperation but a rivalry.
Thank you very much. Thank you also for being controversial and giving us stuff to discuss. also later, surely in the Q&A. I think I've already jotted down a good number of questions that just stimulated a lot of thoughts on my end, but I want to give it right away to Dr. Panda now for your kickoff statement as well. And we talked about perhaps sort of in a way the mirror view a bit on also Indian strategy and how China fits in and the multilateral institutions that we talked about, or the multi-bilateral institutions, if we should call it that, and how the dynamic of the relationship might have changed.
Sure. Thank you, Thomas. Pleasure to be here again in Vienna, and happy to meet actually Yasnina after, I think, we connected with each other
yes.
7 or 8 years back, where I invited her to write a chapter for my edited book. But finally, happy to meet you, and thanks to Thomas for bringing us together. But great to be here with the Vienna Institute of International Affairs. And I think what Yasna has done is that she has given a broad overview about China's security outlook and where does India fits in that security paradigm. Let me throw more lights on the India side so that we could have more discussion. I think a fundamental question arises probably from an independent point of view, that how do we see Indian foreign policy vis-a-vis China? I think 10 years back, probably we will try to see that Indian foreign policy was having a more cooperative approach towards China. Today, that's not the case. Today, Indian foreign policy is very much anti-China. And in one word, I would like to explain that probably we do see a multi-pronged deterrence strategy visible in Indian foreign policy vis-a-vis China. And what are those multi-pronged deterrence strategy? As you know, deterrence is a military term, perceived purely in a militaristic sense, that it is a denial strategy. But more from an academic point of view, I have always argued that deterrence has a multi-pronged perspective. It has to be seen more from a comprehensive outlook, having a militaristic, security, economic dimension attached to it. And this is where Indian foreign policy is moving towards vis-a-vis China. Today, China has emerged as not only as a security challenge, but a key security threat for India. And therefore, the changes we are seeing in Indian foreign policy is a comprehensive deterrence strategy against China. Now, let me narrate this episode why Indian foreign policy is becoming really anti-China today. It's not today. I think history has a connotation, history has a role to play. And we know for a fact that probably 1954 was the beginning when both India and China started trying to narrate the global politics, but they failed. And that was the Ponsisil Agreement, the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, which is very much clearly visible and existing in the UN frameworks, quite openly probably discussed here in Vienna. But that didn't really work out in China-India bilateral relations. 1962, the war happened. Dalai Lama came to India in 1959, and the war happened in 1962. So since that time, since 62 onwards, there has always been a trust deficit between China and India. But what we interestingly witnessed from Indian foreign policy point of view, and also in China and Indian foreign policy, an engagement strategy. An engagement strategy which will stabilize the relationship, and that was visible towards the last phase of the 1990s and towards the beginning of the 21st century, let's say from the beginning of Hu Jintao's period particularly. And during Hu Jintao's period and the former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh's period, the India-China relationship actually became a engagement-oriented partnerships relationship. And there we saw both the countries, as you rightly pointed out, started having collaborations, not only at the bilateral level, but also in various multilateral forums. And the beginning was 2008, where the BRICS was formed. Even though BRICS was a Western conception, the BRICS was formulated, and that development gave a kind of global outlook to China-India relations, that here is a relationship, even though there is a boundary dispute for last 70 to 80 years, but still, despite of the boundary dispute, both can continue to exist at the multilateral level. That episode, unfortunately, did not really lasted long, because the arrival of Xi Jinping changed everything. And therefore, I would highlight few points what has actually encouraged Indian foreign policy to become anti-China and follow a multi-pronged or a comprehensive deterrence strategy against China, or what exactly you were mentioning, Yasrina. I could agree with you on all points. I think the Xi Jinping's arrival in China itself was a brave historical development for China, because China never wanted a leadership like Xi Jinping. There was, even though we knew that Communist Party of China was always at the helm of the power in China, but Xi Jinping's coming to power and arrival in power made it sure that China is no more a country which will in any way think in a democratic means of domestic governance to international relations theory or foreign policy. So as a result, what we saw, a kind of what Xi Jinping has talked about, a new era diplomacy, aggressive foreign policy, militarization effort in the neighboring regions, including in the Himalayan regions, expansion plan, what we saw in the Belt and Road initiatives and in few other foreign policy practices, securitization of issues. We saw China introducing land border laws, maritime laws, and also legalization efforts. And these legalization efforts and some of these issues were very aptly visible in the Himalayan regions, particularly in relations with India, because China started changing maps. China started changing maps and trying to rename those existing disputed bordering regions, including some of the places of India's sovereign state, Arunachal Pradesh. And I think that has changed the narrative in Indian foreign policy. And particularly, I think those three incidents, 2014 incidents in the Chumar Valley, Prime Minister Modi was just 4 to 5 months into power as the Prime Minister of India. He invited Xi Jinping to visit India in 2014. While Xi Jinping is arriving in India, the People's Liberation Army troops are trying to occupy territories in the Chumar region. And I think that itself was a shock for Prime Minister Modi, because Prime Minister Modi was one of those Indian political leaders who was earlier the Chief Minister of Gujarat. And he actually visited China and tried to have an economic engagement strategy with China. In fact, he invited a lot of Chinese investment to his home state, Gujarat. So there was an optimism in Indian foreign policy. Modi coming to power as Prime Minister of India, there was an optimism in Indian foreign policy that here is a relationship which is going to the next level. Unfortunately, Xi Jinping's visit to India and PLA trying to occupy the territories in the Chumar Valley changed the narrative. Not only that, in fact, Modi gave a second chance to Xi Jinping, trying to have a personality-oriented, leadership-oriented chemistry, where he visited Wuhan and also invited Xi Jinping to visit Mahabalipuram to have informal summits between two leaders. That didn't work out. In 2017-18, the Doklam Valley incident happened. The Chinese troops coming to the tri-junction area of India, China, and Bhutan and trying to occupy those territories. And then the most latest story is about during the pandemic. Can anybody really visualize and think that when the world is really going through a rough patch, battling the pandemic, the Chinese People's Liberation Army soldiers coming and trying to occupy the territories? And I think this has permanently changed the Indian foreign policy approach towards China. A leader who was supposed to be much more economically pro-economic oriented and seeing China as an economic partner suddenly changed its foreign policy in 7 to 8 years' time. And today, Indian foreign policy has become much, much more anti-China. Two brief points I would mention before we go for the next round of discussion. One is that how should we, again, visualize Indian foreign policy today in its relationship with China? I think our foreign policy has already become a very competitive foreign policy. And this competitive foreign policy is clearly visible, the kind of narrative India is promoting or Prime Minister Modi is trying to promote. One is our foreign policy, our diplomatic practice is becoming proactive. So I would call it Indian foreign policy as a proactive diplomacy. Now, just taking the point from Yasnina that how India was, before coming to this room, we were discussing about Indian foreign policy approach towards Russia and Ukraine. That explains Indian foreign policy. We have not really abandoned Russia as a partner yet, despite of the mainstream criticism from the European community, for simple reasons. Because it's the day-to-day practice that matters in Indian foreign policy. We have a huge population to feed. We need cheap oil, cheap gas from Russia. We need, we are still purchasing a majority of our weapons from Russia from the Soviet Union period because most of India's military infrastructure is still from the Soviet Union period. And most importantly, I think, I'm not sure how much informed audience in Vienna and in Europe are aware of this fact. India needs Russia's support on some of the key sensitive issues pertaining to the boundary dispute with China and also the boundary dispute with Pakistan, where Russian support is necessary because Russia is a P5 member of the United Nations Security Council. We need to have Russia on the board in order to stop some of these UNSC resolution going in favor of China or going in favor of Pakistan in support of China. So there are geopolitical calculations in the Himalayan regions and in the Eurasian regions which India has to take into consideration. And most importantly, this is a practice in Indian foreign policy one has to understand, and we could discuss about this after this round, is that if you see India's approach towards Russia, it has been quite cooperative primarily because, not at the cost of Ukraine. On Ukraine, India has officially condemned Russia's attack. In fact, Prime Minister Modi has said that it's not a time for war. In fact, he has talked about that the casualties should be condemned and the international community should take proactive measures to stop the war. And in fact, India would play a possible role if there is a context to play a role. That's a separate issue we could discuss. But most interestingly here, why India has to have Russia's supportive hand here? Because you could actually possibly scuttle some of the Chinese initiatives within Shanghai Cooperation Organization, within BRICS, within AIIB, if you partner. If you are not a member, if you don't partner, then possibly it would not be possible to scuttle some of the Chinese initiatives because China is the dominant power in some of these multilateral agencies and multilateral institutions or organizations, whatever you might call. So therefore, India's approach to China is based on a multi-pronged deterrent strategy, which needs to be understood going into the details of the issue. I'll stop here and probably come into the second round. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Again, those were a lot of important points and topics you touched upon that we could get into more deeply going forward. I will also have a number of questions here, but maybe I will start with Justina and the questions I have for her. You talked about China's strategy and its goals, and the question that came to mind for me is, would it not make sense though when China has these ambitious plans for its power in the region, its power globally, the visions it has for reforming global order, and when it really needs allies for that? It might need security partners, it might need economic partners, but it also needs diplomatic partners. And it wants to find these diplomatic partners, I suppose, mostly in the global south, among developing and emerging economies. Would it not make sense to then also try and mobilize, convince India of China's vision? And why do I not see a larger push there? Why is it so difficult for China to try and not have this level of tension with this other giant in the global south, instead of joining forces for its vision on reforming global order?
Well, it's a difficult question, but I think that what is going on and when it comes to the so-called global south, for me, it's a huge problem. What's the global south? To be honest, exactly what kind of criteria we have to take to have this framing. But I think that it's pretty visible. But because China says that China is developing country. Well, it's not, to be frank, but okay, according to China, China is a developing country, India as well, and there's a kind of competition between China and India when it comes to who is the real leader of the global south. So if we have two pretty big powers, they are competing with each other to be a leader of the global south. So it's obvious that they do not want to cooperate with. And it's for me, it is pretty obvious. Of course, the question is about these alliances, the real political partners. So if China really has political partners within those, let's say, global south countries, so it is a huge question mark. This is what China is trying to do, to offering some kind of carrots, but also sticks sometimes. And this is the reason why China would like to depend those countries on China. But I do not think that there is a room for cooperation between China and India, because those two countries would like to lead the global south. And frankly speaking, I don't remember exactly, but China said, I'm not sure if Xi Jinping said that or it was said a few years back, that China would like to be a spokesman of this global south, so the leader, to be frank. So I do not see the potential, the room for cooperation, especially when it comes to global south. It's a competition, obviously, for me.
Thank you very much. Maybe just to contextualize my question. So what I mean is with the very broad and ambitious vision on the Chinese side, also the flurry of white papers that the Chinese Foreign Ministry has published, and there's a sort of summary white paper that came out last year about China's vision of the reforms of global order that should happen, and that pulls together China's global security initiative, its global development initiative, and what it calls its global civilizational initiative, which is sort of about societal relations, human rights, and other matters. And this summary paper is also about reforms of the UN Security Council, obviously a sticking point between China and India that we can talk about more, and about the development of emerging areas of global order that might be still fairly new, like cyber governance and artificial intelligence and so forth. Now, also on what Dr. Panda has said, I would like to comment. Maybe not everybody knows the Panchashila Agreement, the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, was something that also the Chinese government and foreign ministry have pushed as a sort of China's vision for international order for a long time, for decades and decades. And basically it's about emphasizing certain elements of the Charter of the United Nations. So it's about peaceful relations. So, of course, prohibition of use of force is in the UN Charter. It's about sovereignty and territorial integrity and non-interference. Also, of course, things that are in the UN Charter. But to emphasize this and to find commonality in emphasizing this was certainly a matter where China found it useful to help it build stronger relationships with emerging economies and developing economies in what is now termed the Global South, what you could perhaps also term, countries with a post-colonial experience. So this is something that was really relevant in the past, and I would perhaps controversially question whether it still is for China. And I would say that for me at least, there is a lot of tension between China's global security initiative and the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, when China now puts on the same level as sovereignty the respect for the quote-unquote security interests of all countries, which appears to be rather the security interests of major powers, not of all countries. Now, what I would want to ask Dr. Panda is also about, you mentioned the meeting in Wuhan, maybe a problematic city to bring up now. This was really feted at the time as the Wuhan Spirit. In 2018, the meeting between Narendra Modi and Xi Jinping. So at the time, it seems that both sides saw positives in the relationship and also in the potential relationship that they could have, China and India, and maybe them personally. What do you think were the main positives here that led to such a positive atmosphere and made them so hopeful?
I think there are 2 aspects. One is, I think, what I see is that there is a leadership class is there between India and China. And this leadership class earlier used to be based on a leadership chemistry theory, which did not unfortunately work out. Because as you rightly pointed out, the Wuhan Spirit to Mamlapuram, that informal summit that happened between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping, the idea was to build a chemistry and to have probably this annual dialogue, the way India is having with Russia annually, and probably India is having with Japan, which was actually expedited during Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's period. Late Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's period. So those 2 annual summits actually put in an example that here is a relationship, here are 2 neighbors who could possibly have an annual summit between the 2 top leaders, and that will normalize the situation on the bordering regions. But that didn't really work out because Xi Jinping himself is under pressure. He is unable to really have a absolute control over of PLA, because PLA still is those original core group in China's decision-making process, which is curve of territorial ambitions, try to have more territories, and they have their own targets, be it Taiwan to South China Sea to India-China boundary regions. So I think Xi Jinping could not really manage those relationships, and he had a very short vision to Chinese foreign policy, and probably he's thinking that he will be, after Mao Zedong, will be one of those leaders in the Chinese history where the Chinese people will love him so much because he would try to unify China and try to expand China to a greater heights. The second issue is that probably what did not really work out between Prime Minister Modi and Xi Jinping is that I think Prime Minister Modi's much more global oriented foreign policy, even though Indian economy is not really at that part of Chinese economy. Today, probably Indian economy is still 4.5 or 5 times lower than the Chinese economy. But still, I think India's foreign policy canvas has expanded under Prime Minister Modi. And what you were talking about, the global South, there is a fundamental difference between India's approach to global south, China's approach to global south, particularly under Prime Minister Modi and under President Xi Jinping. India's narrative of global south is based on a shared leadership principle, whereas China's narrative of global south is based on lead leadership principle. So here Xi Jinping wants to have that lead, China wants to have the lead. We know for a fact that, as you rightly pointed out, be it SCO, be it BRICS, be it AIIB, China wants to dominate most of the forums. And therefore, when we are talking about global south, even the global south is not necessarily a new concept. It did existed in 1960s, 70s, when actually we are talking about those three types of world: first world, second world, and third world. And during the third world conception, there was a lot of discussion about global south. But only recently it has been revitalized in many sense by Indian leadership and Chinese leadership. But I think the way India looks at it, India looks at the shared leadership. And as a matter of example, during the G20 summit, Prime Minister Modi invited African Union to become a part of the G20 expanded version. And that explains that there is an Indian approach to the foreign policy, global foreign policy outlook, that we want more participation of lower end or emerging economies in the global forums. But when it comes to the Chinese approach, if you see, when it comes to the global south proposition, the Chinese approach has been that China wants to lead and then everybody should be around. And that has been a foreign policy clash between Indian foreign policy approach and Chinese foreign policy approach, and particularly Modi's approach and Xi Jinping's approach. And if you see the way Xi Jinping has orchestrated the foreign policy, there was a much more active foreign policy approach during his initial years. And then after the pandemic, he is unable to find a rhythm to its foreign policy expansion plan. As a result, what today we see that they are talking about, the three security initiatives, the three foreign policy initiatives we discussed, the developmental initiatives, security initiatives, and civilizational initiatives. These are trying to revitalize the foreign policy objectives in a new form. But I'm not sure if it's going to work out for China. China has lost Europe in many ways after the Ukraine war, the way China has supported Russia. But India has not really lost Europe. In fact, I must mention here, I think India has gained Europe after the Ukraine war. And the difference that exists between Europe and India after the Ukraine war is a positive development. And let me explain why. If you see the kind of debates that has happened and the criticism that India has faced, because India has provided that supportive stand towards Russia, has actually allowed Indian foreign policy thinkers and the European foreign policy thinkers to sit together and to debate it out. Differentiation always brings you closer. Unless you debate it out, unless you dialogue, you cannot really understand each other's viewpoint. And that has actually helped Indian foreign policy and European foreign policy thinkers to come closer. As a result, today, you see, we have EU-India trade and technology initiatives. That actually allows us to discuss more about trade and technological issues. More interestingly, if you see, India has opened embassies in some of the Baltic countries, particularly in Lithuania. India's relationship with Sweden has gone to the next stage. India has started India-Nordic summits. And most interestingly, if you see, Prime Minister Modi has visited Europe continuously after the Ukraine war. And most interestingly, he has visited recently to Ukraine despite of the fact that India is supportive to Russia. So there is no hidden agenda that India follows. It's an open foreign policy practice to become a comprehensive, to pursue that comprehensive engagement strategy. So therefore, I think just to answer your questions very briefly, it is a foreign policy class as well as a personality-oriented class between Xi Jinping and Modi that we are currently witnessing in Indian and Chinese foreign policy.
Thank you. Did you want to respond?
Yeah, because to be honest, as you mentioned about this India's position towards Russia, and I would like to say that I agree with you that there is no hidden agenda when it comes to India, but I think that it's not very easy for us as Europeans to, let's say, accept, in a sense, or understand still India's position towards Russia. And frankly speaking, there are many discussions, at least in expert community, that on the one hand we are very critical about China's position, because China in an open way supports Russia, but it is also a huge question for us, for the expert community, when it comes to India, because still India has a pretty good relations with Russia, and I think it is still some kind of problem when it comes to our relations between Europe and India. But I agree with you that it's a difference with China, that there is no hidden agenda, that Indian experts, they explain to us why your policy is like this. It is not possible to talk openly with the Chinese experts, but I would like to underscore that for expert community, and I think also for politicians in Europe, I think that it is not very comfortable to have a conversation with India, bearing in mind that India still has pretty friendly relations with Russia.
Can I quickly comment 1 minute? Or
Sure, but I'll provide one note of context, perhaps, at least as far as I know, in July and August 2024, when you look at Russia's energy exports, I think China bought about 45%, and then you had India and Turkey maybe on similar levels, maybe 15% or something. And then you still have the EU, which we shouldn't forget, still is the fourth most important customer, and follows India and Turkey rather closely. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I think I agree again with both of your remarks and narratives, and particularly Justina. I think yes, I do agree. I think despite the fact that India has a cooperative relationship, EU's approach has been quite positive towards India, even though EU is very critical the way the position India has taken. But again, I think this also opens for us to think a little more openly. Couple of things we need to think. One is that, if you see the entire episode of the Ukraine war, despite of the Ukraine war, EU has not completely stopped purchasing the Russian oil and energy for some time. And that itself explains that, EU, even though it's a pan-political union, still it does not have that singular approach to stop purchasing oil and energy from Russia. And therefore, it comes as a lesson for India. If the biggest populous country in the world, how is it going to survive if it continues to purchase oil and gas on a very high price? So that has been one practical consideration for India. The second is also we have to understand and appreciate India's foreign policy position, the way India is, because me and Thomas has agreed in a webinar, we discussed about Himalaya cannot be changed, and India and China's position, geographic position cannot be changed, and therefore India's problem with China vis-a-vis China's problem with India will continue to persist, and therefore India has to maintain that cordial relations with Russia at some stage. But more interestingly, if you see, let's look at the global foreign policy developments that India is having with US particularly. India's relationship with US has expanded despite of the fact, in last 20 years or 15 years trajectory, if you see about India and US, it has gone up despite of the fact that US, knowing the fact that India is still well connected with China in the AIIB, India is still very connected with China in the BRICS and in the SCO membership as a member, and also India has a good connections with Russia. Still, United States of America has decided to see India as the fulcrum partner of in Indo-Pacific. Today, India and US partnership is based on 4 foundational agreements where a lot of trade, defense and security-oriented partnership is unfolding. That itself explains that United States of America is still open to see India in a certain futuristic context. So therefore, we should not have a close eye to only try to see India from the lens of India's relationship with Russia. It has to be seen as a future power, and what the power from the Indian Ocean regions could actually help in terms of welcoming EU's global gateway strategy, welcoming EU's Indo-Pacific strategy, and particularly trying to have a more specific collaboration bilaterally between EU and India. So those considerations has to be also taken into account when we are talking about India's relationship with Russia.
Thank you very much. Now, I still want to ask both of you one more question before I open the floor for questions from the audience. So if we can try and get back to China's view of its neighborhood and how, which goals it wants to achieve and how much risk it wants to take and where. Could you maybe try and think about where the analogies are between different regions here, which behaviors we see on the Chinese side, and how far it wants to go with perhaps the more contentious relationships?
Yeah, sure. Because preparing to today's meeting, I started to think about what China is doing in Himalaya region, of course, because this is the topic of today's conversation, but also thinking about what China is doing in other places within the Asia Pacific, the neighborhood. And I would like to be honest. I think that what China is doing in Himalaya region is a kind of a low-profile activity. Because when it comes to China, we are talking mostly about Taiwan Strait. It is high on the agenda, especially since COVID, that we realize that we are really connected or dependent on Taiwan, but also on Malacca Strait, Taiwan Strait, on our supply chains in Asia, generally speaking, different countries. We are talking about South China Sea, also because of trade routes. We are talking about DPRK and Korean Peninsula, generally speaking. Recently, we started to talk about what China is doing in Pacific, in small islands, because the connections, ties with Taiwan, and the fact that there is the U.S. presence there. So those kind of hotspots are very visible, and we are talking about those hotspots, but not about Himalaya region. And when I started to look what China is doing in this region, I realized that there are many similarities, but also differences when it comes to China's activities. So similarities, comparing to South China Sea, Taiwan Strait, East China Sea as well, is the kind of border disputes, some kind of attempts to change the status quo, some kind of attempts to depend those countries on China using both carrots and sticks, so charm offensive and coercion, so similarities. But there are also differences, and this is the reason why I think China does not want to be very provocative and to instigate some of a crisis. Why? First of all, the huge difference between, let's say, South China Sea, Taiwan Strait, and those hotspots in the Himalaya region is that there is no U.S. presence. So this is very important. No U.S. presence. Okay. There is to some extent Russia's presence, but Russia right now is pretty weak, controlled by China, dependent on China, in China's pocket. So Russia is not a power that could. So frankly speaking, I disagree with this Indian thinking that, of course, Russia is important because to some extent we can use Russia to cooperate with Russia, to some extent drive a wedge between China and Russia, because we know that there is a kind of alliance, let's say, between China and Russia. I do not agree, because China is a really huge power, and then Russia is really dependent right now, since Russia's invasion especially. So no U.S. presence, Russia is pretty weak. And what is also, so to be honest, the main challenge for China in this region is India. But still, India, and right now, India is not so powerful to be a real challenge for China. So to be frank, it is a very comfortable situation for China to be pretty active in this region, but not put on it higher on the agenda, not to make this so visible that we start talking about that. And China, to some extent, is using the power vacuum. Sorry for that. India is important country and becoming as an emerging power, but still for China is not a big deal still. So it is a very comfortable moment for China to be pretty active, to use various kinds of incentives, sometimes also some kind of sticks, to make those countries close to China, dependent on China, before India's rise as a superpower. So I do not think that that we should expect some kind of a conflict, hot war, some kinetic conflict in this region.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting. Sort of the argument that China does not want escalation, but still takes assertive actions because it thinks perhaps there's not too great a risk connected to them.
Yep.
Now, I would, of course, would like to ask Dr. Panda what he thinks about this, but let me frame it a bit more broadly. You talked about the bloody clashes on the border in past years. Now, it's, of course, important context that the Chinese side has also engaged in a very strong infrastructure push on its side of the border, connecting its more western regions, so Tibet and Xinjiang, with the central Chinese and coastal Chinese regions, and also in Tibet and Xinjiang to connect more remote areas with infrastructure nodes and get infrastructure really close to the border, and also build new villages and outposts on the border. And it's important context also that the Indian side responded and also has a strong infrastructure push to connect with remote border areas. Now, with this as context, I would like to ask you what is the level of tension now on the borders, and how do you expect this to develop? Also with a view to what Justina said about China's logic, and of course you being a China scholar yourself, but for more than 15 years back in the day, a think tanker in New Delhi. Maybe I can ask you about both perspectives.
Sure. No, thank you. I think that's an interesting question. But before that, I'll just touch upon the point Justina was pointing out. I think I broadly agree with you, but we need to see it more skeptically from the sub-regional level. Mm-hmm. And let me brought out this point that I think we should not mix up the regions, because within China, Russia's foreign policy, there is a competition exists, and it's a permanent competition. Despite of what's happening after the Ukraine war, the signing agreements, both Putin and Xi Jinping meeting, the fundamental does not change between China and Russia. And the fundamental between China and Russia are the complexity in the Eurasian regions. When it comes to the Eurasian regions, because here we are talking about Shanghai Cooperation Organizations, we are talking about AIIB, BRICS, and most of these agencies or multilateral forums are focusing on the Eurasian subregions. Now, when it comes to the Eurasian subregions, China wants to have a unipolar Eurasia, whereas Russia wants to have a multipolar Eurasia, because Russia is losing out international allies and partnerships. And I have written about this, that there is a permanent problems exist between China and Russia, between Putin's idea and Xi Jinping's idea. And that needs to be broken up. If we play a kind of a spoil sports there, we could actually create that possible division between China and Russia. Who are the powers could possibly play that division? You cannot play from outside. If you play from outside, then you are actually running into an authoritarian nexus. So you have to be within the multilateral organizations to play that role. And there is no better influential power than India to play that role. And therefore, today we are a part of Shanghai Cooperation Organization to support some of the Russian endeavors. so that the Chinese endeavors will be checked. We are part of the BRICS and SCO and as well as the AIIB, so that we could also play spoil sports. Of course, India is a beneficiary at a greater level in some of these multilateral agencies. But to create that necessary divisions between the two, you have to play that role smartly. So these dynamics has to be understood, and also in the local context, and trying to link with your point. There are permanent problems exist in the South Asian regions. For example, the Pakistan-occupied Kashmir that India has been talking about. Those are problematic issues not only from territorial point of view, but also from the point of view of terrorism and extremism. For a number of years, US has overlooked the regions. Pakistan has actually sponsored cross-border terrorism. India has been complaining for 2 to 3 decades, maybe more. US has overlooked those issues. The Chinese have got a better hand with the Pakistanis to control over the extreme Uyghur communities. But there, India has got absolute support from Russians to some extent. If we don't get the support from Russia, then the situation will get quite problematic from India's point of view. You might recall how many terrorist incidents India has faced over the last 3 decades or so. More problematic is if you see the China-India boundary dispute or India-Pakistan dispute per se, Russia has always maintained a neutral position. So therefore, we need Russia's support. Coming to the boundary dispute between India and China, I think what you were hinting at about those civilian villages, the Xiao Kang model that Xi Jinping is talking about, I think that's one of those smart initiatives that Xi Jinping introduced, following Hu Jintao's second-term tenure, where Hu Jintao actually promoted a Western development strategy when he came to power in the first term, and gradually the Chinese built up, trying to look at the Xinjiang region, the Tibetan regions, and in the Western Ladakh, the China-India boundary regions. There, what we saw a civilian plus military mix infrastructure built up. And the same kind of thing also India is today doing on its own part, on its own side of the border. So there is a infrastructural clash, a competition is happening in the China-India border, which is actually escalating the tensions. And India is in no position to stop those infrastructural construction, because one of the positive aspects of Prime Minister Modi's foreign policy is that it is a much more practical foreign policy, and there he focuses a lot on infrastructural development, be it in the bordering regions or be it within the different parts of India. Modi government focuses a lot on road development, railway developments, infrastructural development, hotel to airport developments, and this is what we are seeing today. India is becoming a much more infrastructural friendly country. A lot of developments is going on, and most of these developments are quite visible in the bordering regions. That has actually, antagonized the Chinese, because they were seeing India not as a very competent economy. Today also they don't see India not necessarily a competent economy. But India carrying out those infrastructural development annoying the Chinese, because that also giving India to some extent a lot of advantages. So therefore, I don't think the boundary dispute is going to be solved anytime soon, because the Chinese are changing the status quo of the negotiation formula very quickly. More problematic is the infrastructural development on both sides. That would actually create a very tenseful situation, and the way the Chinese are claiming, the changing the map and trying to rename the areas in the bordering regions, that would definitely keep India on a hook to stay alert, and therefore I don't really see the tensions in the bordering regions coming down anytime soon. There might be a relative peace, but there won't be any permanent peace in the bordering regions.
Thank you so much. I'm sure we've also inspired questions in the audience, and I will now give you the opportunity to ask them. So I think I will take 3 at a time. Thank you very much. Apparently, we even have a microphone that will be passed to you. Thank you so much, Johannes. You want to go first? Both the two of you.
very much indeed. Currently Institute of the Danube region, but I've served also in Asian countries. I just wonder, because Malay and the Himalaya region is one problem. The other one is to the south of India, because the Maldives just changed totally from pro-India to pro-China. And when you look at Sri Lanka, for instance, it has been for years now that Chinese influence was growing, and now we must expect even more probably Chinese influence. Another question is about the South China Sea. I mean, what is the Indian position as China just reclaims huge territories which were formerly also or still should be with the Philippines or even Vietnam? And there is another position, for instance, of Indonesia. They are not in the BRICS, if I understand, because in BRICS you are just number 3. So you are sort of howling with the wolves, but only as number 3. So I would just wonder, would India like to dance at all weddings? It's not so clear. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, India is dancing on all weddings. That's absolutely true just now. India is everyone's darling in the international scene, because many advisors always said there's no change in Indian foreign policy. I think this is absolutely wrong. India changed from non-alignment to multi-alignment. If you know this, you understand many of the steps of India. Of course, rivals and not partners. Partners somehow in the some economic fields, at international conferences and so on. But in general, you are right. There's an old Chinese proverb, it's impossible that 2 suns shine in the sky. Okay, that's the Chinese idea of India in one proverb. The demarcation of the borderline in the Himalayas has never been done. The line of control, the lock, has never been demarcated since how many years? 70 years? 75 years?
1958.
1958. So why was it not possible so far? My idea is the Himalayas are not so important for China, but they keep the Indian troops there, hundreds of thousands of men, and these troops are not at the Pakistan border at the same time. So we have the close friendship between China and Pakistan, and India is surrounded on both sides in its own way. So this might explain some of the Chinese movements in the Himalayas, because it's not much to get there in 5,000-meter altitude. It's foolish. The whole problem is finally it's foolish. I want to ask Mr. Panda, much more important is the Indian Ocean with international trade and connections. I spoke to some Indian colleagues. There is a different understanding that the Indian Ocean is for India India's ocean, and it is necessary. It is necessary to have this huge fleet of warships between the Strait of Malacca and the Strait and the Malacca Strait. And what's about that? Is of course this is against all ideas of China. India wants to have a close input in the Indian Ocean for the time to come.
Thank you very much.
Finally, yes, changing maps, of course, it's a big question, but how India fits into the Chinese strategy, so far, as you rightly said, India is not really important for the Chinese grand design. I'm asking Mr. Panda, we have this 100 years in 2047 in India, 2049 in China. It's a huge rivalry. So far, the Indian foreign policy has not developed a grand design. Do you think it will work out in the future? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Johannes, could you also hand the microphone to your colleague in green, 2 rows back? Yeah, to the lady with the glasses. Sorry. Yeah, yes.
Thanks a lot for the very interesting discussion. So I just came back from India yesterday, where I stayed in Ladakh and also in Bhutan for a few days. So in Ladakh, of course, China has been encroaching. We know through changing of maps the Chinese ambitions in Arunachal Pradesh, naming it South Tibet and all these kind of things. So I'm interested in the visions of China. How is the situation concerning Ladakh? Even though I agree that there is not like an imminent conflict coming up, is China writing, saying in any strategy papers that there could be the danger of overtaking Ladakh to some extent? And my second question would be concerning the Indian foreign minister's comments recently about 75% of the boundary issues have been resolved. Do you see this as a relaxation in these tensions? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'll take these as a group of questions for now, and then we're going to give more of you the opportunity to ask questions. So I have Chinese influence in the Maldives and Sri Lanka, maybe taken together with how do views of the Indian Ocean clash, India's and China's and influence there. I have India's position on South China Sea disputes, the change from non-alignment to multi-alignment. I have the close relationship between China and Pakistan and its connection to border demarcation, and I have Ladakh from a Chinese perspective. All right. Who wants to start?
All questions to Jagannath. No. I have no idea about India.
You want to start?
Okay. So let me first highlight those changes in Indian foreign policy. I think those are important things to understand the India's vision plan and whether India has a grand strategy or not. There are a number of changes we could notice in Indian foreign policy. You are right that from non-alignment to multi-alignment. Within that also there are new developments has come up in Indian foreign policy. I have written about it plenty of times. One of the major argument I have put it in open forums through different writings is that within that multi-alignment, what we have seen, India is having a pointed alignment strategy. And pointed alignment strategy is a issue-based strategy. You continue to expand your partnerships, engagement with a particular country, no matter they are really beneficial geostrategically or not. For example, with the US, it's going to be a global partnership in Indo-Pacific. It's an Indo-Pacific oriented global partnership we are envisioning. Whereas in Russia, with Russia, it's a business transactional partnerships. So it's the points of the issues or the issue-based partnerships we are looking at. So even the Indian foreign policy has transformed from non-alignment to multi-alignment. Within that multi-alignment, we are looking at our interest, our issues, what really matters to India or India's security interest. And therefore, every relationship matters to India. So therefore, the narrative that India's foreign policy is in a very good position, taking advantage and being a darling of the global politics, I would not really deny that. It's a welcome narrative, but we have to see it much more in a practical sense. But within that, I think there are 4 or 5 issues which is clearly visible. And these are the positive changes in Indian foreign policy. One, Indian foreign policy has become permanently anti-China. Unless Xi Jinping and another leader comes and do something dramatic and try to forget the boundary dispute and try to resolve it, it would be difficult for India to shed away or remove those anti-China narratives in Indian foreign policy. So for next 20 to 30 years, Indian foreign policy will continue to become much more anti-China. Second, the partnership with West is going to expand. We are seeing the relationship with the US, despite of many problems between India and US, despite of India and US not being on a common platform, be it on North Korean issues, on Iran issues, on sensitive technological issues, where the US has not really shared the critical technologies with India, despite of the 4-on-5 foundational agreement. But still the partnership is expanding. US is looking at India much more positively what it used to be 10 years back. So there is a progressive momentum is visible. And within that, India's engagement package with the US, here comes the partnership with the EU, as I was mentioning earlier today. The relationship with not only EU as a pan-political platform, but also with the EU member states. 10 years back, probably India's outreach to all the EU member states was not there. Today we are having embassies and outreach almost in all the EU member states. And that's a positive development. And particularly after the pandemic and particularly after the Ukraine war, a lot of positivity has come. So Europe has not stopped visiting India despite of India's supportive stance towards Russia. India has not stopped coming to EU. And that's a positive change, that despite of these problematic perceptions on Ukraine and Russia war, EU and India are looking each other under a future-oriented engagement. That's another change. The third and decisive change that we are noticing in Indian foreign policy is that what we discussed earlier is the global South narrative. Here is India. I mean, global South narrative is one aspect which we could see from a particular lens, that these are emerging economies or these are economies which wants to have a global voice in a global platform. So therefore, they need to be united. But more interestingly, if you see in Indian foreign policy, the positivity that has taken place is that India has started emerging as a supplier, either as a defense supplier or as a aid giver, economic and aid giver. And that was not really the case 10 years back. Today we have started supplying BrahMos missiles to some of the Southeast Asian countries we have started talking to, including having a good defense-oriented partnerships with Armenia, having a comprehensive partnership with Poland today, where after PM Modi's visit, we have officially declared it as a comprehensive strategic partnership, even though there are many gray areas are there between India and Poland. So these are the positive momentum that India is looking at the global canvas, particularly the global South countries, in a much more, in an open framework, emerging as a defense supplier to aid and, in a much more economic-oriented partnerships. Coming back to the Indian Ocean narrative, I don't think officially India says that it is India's ocean. What India portrays in the official parlance is that we continue to say that it is a country positioned ocean where India is the fulcrum. And therefore, when we are saying Indian Ocean, India does come there as a prominent country because 3 sides of Indian territories are exposed to the Indian Ocean. And Indian geography is very much open to Indian Ocean, and that itself explains that it is closely linked with the Middle East, with the Gulf regions, where EU has a role to play. In the South China Sea, where EU has a role to play, including in the Bay of Bengal regions, including in the Sri Lankan and Maldives regions. So I think it is a range of issues that is being understood, because nobody really talked about Indian Ocean that more from the energy and geopolitical point of view 10 years back. And I think 10, 15 years only, we have started focusing a lot on the moment China started building those ports and listening points. So we started focusing more on Indian Ocean, even though Indian Ocean has always been a highlights of global politics for centuries. My last point here would be about the Ladakh incident and about India's grand strategy. Let me comment first about the Ladakh and about 75% of the border that EM. I think what the EM was pointing at, and I think it is necessary to understand Dr. Jaishankar, External Affairs Minister's background. He himself is a diplomat with China background. He has served as India's ambassador to China and also to the US. So his China background helped us to make this statement that if you see between the India and China, the boundary negotiation strategy, it was actually in a very, very positive platform before Xi Jinping came to power. And there were 2 or 3 mechanisms through which both China and India were trying to address the boundary issues. One was WMCC, working mechanism on coordination and consultation, which is held at the joint secretary and the in the Chinese side at the director level, trying to talk about the ground realities on the boundary dispute. Then there was special representative level talk between India's National Security Advisor and China's State Council level. And that did not really proceed much because of the this incident which is happening from 2016, in fact 2014 onwards. Chumar incident 2014, 2016-17 the Doklam incident, and then the Galwan incident in 2019-20. During that, what has happened is that all of these negotiation strategies has been derailed. There is no continuity to those negotiation strategies.
But why?
Because the Chinese were changing the status quo. They were trying to capture the areas in the boundary regions. They were trying to portray new maps. They were trying to put pressure and try to occupy the regions. And also, most importantly, on Arunachal Pradesh, they were trying to capture new territories, including in the Ladakh in the western regions. And that itself was not well received in India, the way India responded. So therefore, the point here needs to be noted that the boundary negotiation strategy has been derailed. It's not in the same process that it used to be. So therefore, Dr. Joy Shankar's statement is that all of these issues has been discussed earlier, and it was in a very positive platform when the dispute actually deteriorated further after Xi Jinping came to power. So what he's pointing out that 75% of those issues has already been clarified, and we were already there at a negotiated platform to resolve the boundary dispute and to proceed to a next level. So I read it from that context, even though he was also mentioning about the Western Ladakh particularly, because he was trying to say that everything is right in the Western Ladakh regions, in the Galwan Valley regions, and there are things has been 75% has been. But I see it much more in a bigger context. My last point is about the India's global strategy. I would be very open to say this, that when I try to study about the foreign policies of the countries, given my background about studying about Chinese foreign policy, Japanese foreign policy, Korean foreign policy, including Indian foreign policy, I find a flaw in each of these countries' foreign policy. That these countries' foreign policy often talks about big ideas, but not having a grand strategy. Now, I might be, as a scholar, I might be critical, but when it comes to practicality of the terms, it's actually wise enough not to have a grand strategy. Because once you are having a grand strategy, you are defining your foreign policy to move in certain direction. And the global politics is not really going to move in a particular direction. Here is pandemic came, changed the world politics. The Ukraine war came, then a lot has changed. So I don't think that it is wise to have a grand strategy all the time.
But the Chinese believe in that grand strategy.
I think India also similarly could argue that we have a grand strategy. But I think it is positive for India not to have a grand strategy. I'll stop there. And
that's a very interesting point. Thank you so much for this grand tour through many questions. I will give us a few more minutes if we have a very pressing question from the audience. Yes, Johannes, could you have the lady in the third row?
Hello, my name is Ying. I come from China, but I'm doing Africa studies here. So very interesting to hear your talks, although I do not agree most of it. For example, when you mention a lot, China is today's competitors of EU countries or US. But I would like to say that the competitors' ideas from the theory of realism, like this it's not win-win, but zero-sum theory. But I want to emphasize one important part of Chinese culture is 中庸, which means being moderate. So historically, we don't like to be leader, we like to be followers. So we follow the trend of globalization. So China benefits from of it. So that is why I don't think China would like to start a so-called hot war. I agree with you at that point, because we benefit from the trade, benefit from globalization in last 40 minutes instead of wars. And we didn't join any wars with Africa, or we never colonized India before. So that is also, I confused why you see China as a threat rather than Britain, your previous colonial countries. My question is regarding that, do you think that India's anti-China policy is really benefit to today's India's future or not?
you.
Okay, thank you.
Another pressing question, the row behind. But I think we're already 5 minutes over, so we'll have to have brief questions and brief responses, please.
India is good friend with Russia and the Western world, as we heard. So could India be like a peacemaker in the Ukraine?
No.
Thank you. All right. Dr. Pandey, would you like to respond?
Yes, very problematic questions. Let me answer two questions. Whether anti-China narrative will benefit India. Very shortly, I will not elaborate it. As I mentioned earlier, when Prime Minister Modi came to power, he saw China in a positive light. Did that really help? Becoming pro-China, has it really helped India all these years? 1962 war, many incidents on the border, Tibet, Dalai Lama, it has not really helped India. And I think the position India today is taking probably is going to be permanent, anti-China, but that's unfortunate. Because both Chou En-lai and Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, they decided to talk about Pencil Agreement. But that never happened. So being positive has never been helpful for India. So probably being anti-China, who knows? We have to wait. Second, about India becoming peacemaker on the Ukraine war. I would not really read India as a peacemaker. And I think primarily because India comes from a position, not from a position of strength, but a position of relative disadvantage. As we discussed in this room and also elsewhere for last 2.5 years since I have moved to Europe at the same time when the Ukraine war started, I'm hearing Europe has been quite critical on India on the Ukraine issue. So Europe will never accept India's viewpoint because Europe has a very fixed mentality that India is pro-Russia. So that is number one. Number two, why the Ukraine plan would not work for India to play mediator? Because Russia is not the same power what world really thinks about. Putin is a very dogmatic leader. Putin would not like to listen to Modi. Rather, Putin, the kind of leader he is, he would like to negotiate hard directly with Ukraine to have a concession and move NATO out of its neighboring regions. So India possibly cannot play that role, and Putin knows that. Because India is not a kind of dialogue partner or a member of the NATO alliance, I think. So Putin clearly understands the limitations of Prime Minister Modi or India per se. So therefore, keeping all of this, all of these factors into account, I would say that probably it will be too ambitious for India to prepare a peace plan, and it would be too ambitious to expect that Putin and Ukraine or Russia and Zelensky would agree to India's peace plan. So I would not really go into that. Even the Prime Minister Modi's visit to Ukraine and including to Poland has been quite positive. There has been a number of positive developments and it has been well taken. India sees this visit as a success, Prime Minister Modi's visit to success, but I would not really call or anticipate India to play that role because of the obvious reasons. There is a strategic perceptual gap exists between Europe and India and Russia and India. Despite of India's good relationship with Putin, Russia still don't think India as a reliable partner.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Panda. Thank you, Dr. Schüttlich. Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. Thank you for your questions. I hope we will see you soon again at our next events. Have a great evening. Thank you for giving us 10 more minutes.